Hi, Misha here, and last time when we were looking at Russian submachine guns, I rambled on a lot about the PPD and the PPS-41. Now it's time to look at another design, the PPS, as well as talk about what was going on in the world of submachine guns, and we'll talk about these two semi-automatic conversions, the upper one done by T&W and the lower one, as you know, done by Pioneer Arms. In fact, this was the first Pioneer Arms import to the USA back before, things went the way they did. So with that, we'll conclude this mini-series and talk about use in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. Let's look at the semi-automatic conversions here done for the American market. Of course, these are both originally open-bolt submachine guns fired with a sear. Since 1981, give or take, the ATF has not permitted the American civilian market to do open-bolt semi-autos. It's a weird thing, but effectively it's not allowed. Also in America, if you're going to do a carbine, so with a shoulder stock, you need a barrel at least 16 inches. And actually, before the 70s, it was worse. It was 18 inches, so yeah. The way T&W did this one, I really liked the shroud, that they extended the shroud out all the way. It still looks a little odd, but at least it looks somewhat normal. And it has a working muzzle brake system. And it does have the original barrel here. You can see where they attach an extension. Where is it at? It's in here. You guys probably see it. There it is, yeah. Little step there where they go from the original barrel to an extension tube. And of course they do have to convert it to closed bolt. And when you do that, you have two choices: striker fired or hammer fired. And there were some companies that tried to do a striker fired PPS-41 Inner Arms. Was one of them. The problem is, because of this takedown system here, if you have a striker and it's cocked and you open it, your striker will go flying forward. Now, the way that some companies get around that, they simply welded the tab closed, meaning to disassemble it, you just remove the front screw. That's one way of doing it. But T&W went to a forked hammer system, which allowed for using the original recoil spring and buffer, which I like. And of course, the original bolt had a fixed firing pin. For a semi-auto, you need to go to, cock it back here maybe. I can get my finger there. Nope, I should have cocked that before. Anyway, they had to put a firing pin in the bolt that was floating, so when the hammer comes forward, it hits it. It left the extractor and ejector the same, and it feeds from standard magazines, which is always a plus. And these are built from wartime kits that were refurbished, or wartime guns that were refurbished after the war and put into storage, so you'll often see the refurbishment marks on the stocks. The only downside to this conversion, the trigger isn't great, which is an issue with a lot of conversions. It's fine. I've felt worse, but could be better. But all in all, this is a nice one. I picked it up years ago from Military Gun Supply. They had kits and they supplied them to T&W to build under contract for them. And the owner of Military Gun Supply hooked me up with a few, to which I'm very grateful. I'm never going to afford or even want a full auto original, so this will do, since most all of the parts are genuine, just converted to make it legal. it is what it is. Better to be happy with what you have than to lament what you don't. And here we have the PPS-43C. These were initially imported by IO, manufactured by Pioneer Arms in the town of Radom, Poland. But they were manufactured using mostly original Circle 11 Luxnick Radom parts, including the original 9.5-inch barrel, original shroud. Then they cut them here, and then this back section is a new only not tube, but receiver section. That's why it's dimpled in the top to not allow a full auto bolt to fit. And I think it was really cool. This is one of the first times they let a gun come in with the stock on, but it was pinned closed. Originally, they were welded externally, very visible. Later versions that would come in would have this fixing inside. And of course, they face the same issue, making it go from an open bolt to a closed. And again, they went to a small hammer system. Some American companies, before they thought about it hard, did try doing a striker. This is even more troublesome, especially as a pistol, because of where the button is. Yeah, don't do one of these as a striker. Bad things may happen. Even if you know what you're doing when you fire the gun, wait till you hand it to someone else. But the good news is they were able to retain the original recoil system here. And they used the original bolt, just modifying it again to have a floating firing pin. Interestingly, the very first PPS designs had a replaceable firing pin. It was still fixed, but it wasn't machined as part of the bolt. But that didn't last long. There's a bit of a buffer in the back of these. It's kind of a felt type buffer. Although I think the newer ones, these are the PAC imports. They replaced the felt because it was deteriorating with a more modern rubber. And our hammer. It's not the best hammer system, but it works reasonably reliably. Funnily enough, when these came in, they had test fired them with military ammo over in Poland, which actually led to, trying to get my thing seated there properly. There we go. Locks on nice and tight. Which led to some issues here with commercial ammo, with soft primers, runaway firing. So then they reworked the firing pin to work with commercial ammo, and then some people complained that with hard military primers, they didn't always have successful detonation. The point is, you can't really always have it both way. You can't have it shooting World War II era ammo, Cold War era surplus ammo, and then modern commercial ammo made from several different manufacturers. You kind of have to tailor a gun for one or the other. So, with the lack of surplus available these days, probably a good thing that it can shoot commercial stuff. Also a good thing that the ATF doesn't recognize this as anything but a magwell and did not force them to alter it. Huzzah. No, I really like how they did this one. It even has a decent military-style blued finish. Yeah, the Pioneer Arms started off pretty strong in the USA with this gun, in my opinion, especially for the money. These were very affordable, $300 to $500 depending on when you bought one. And they usually came with extra mags and all that good stuff. That's just kind of a look through. Sorry, this is easier to do for me when I'm in front of the camera, not behind it, but needs must. Do my best. Historians and gun enthusiasts like to separate things into generations, and submachine guns are no different. Most every nation entered World War II with late Generation 1 submachine guns. The U.S. had the Thompson. Britain had the Lanchester and also used the Thompson. Finland had the Suomi we looked at. Russia had the PPD various versions. Germany had the MP-38. And that was one of the first that was starting to kind of slide into Generation 2, as was the PPS-41. But very soon after the war began, especially nations on the defense like Britain and Russia realized the utility of a submachine gun. Cheap, simple, quick to mass produce, fired relatively inexpensive and easy to make ammo, and effectively turned an infantryman into a machine gunner, at least for close range defensive fighting. So everyone started going to faster to produce guns, also more compact guns, because World War II was not proving to be a stagnant warfare like trench warfare. No, it was very mobile, and it had a lot of house-to-house urban warfare. Germany was one of the first to introduce a Generation 2 submachine gun with the MP-40. It was built with more stamped parts, synthetic furniture instead of wood, and it was built with an underfolding buttstock to make it compact. Britain would soon follow with the Sten gun, also built from a lot of stamping or tubing. It did not have a folding or collapsing stock, but it had an easily detachable stock, so, for transport. Ironically, both of these, especially the Sten, are derived from the Bergmann, like the PPD, and to some extent. That gun, the MP-18 and MP-28, had a lot of influence. And of course, in America, they simplified the Thompson, first with the 1928 A1, soon the M1 and M1A1, but they would develop their own stamped gun, kind of the American Sten, if you will, the M3 grease gun, built from stamped parts and with a collapsing wire shoulder stock, even cheaper and easier to mass produce than what Germany was rocking with. So, hey, good on them. Another thing that second generation subguns of World War II seem to feature, now some like the Sten were still select fire, and you can argue that PPS-41 was an early Gen 2 or transitional. Some remained select, but many, like the grease gun, were just full auto only. So, yeah. And Russia certainly took note. The Papasha was a great gun, easy to mass produce, but it wasn't perfect, and it had a few things that probably could be done away with. And that's where we end up with our PPS. This kind of dates back to 1941 after Operation Barbarossa and getting into the beginning of the siege of Leningrad, the famous 900 days. The Red Army, the powers that be in Russia, wanted a weapon for personal defense, that kind of thing, that was as accurate and reliable and still firing the Tokarev round as the PPSH, but it needed to be cheaper, faster to mass produce, and being more compact would be a good thing too, since mechanized warfare. So in other words, they wanted a solidly Generation 2 submachine gun. And they already had a couple of people sketch things out. There was a lieutenant at one of their academies who created a few designs on paper. Well, Alexei Sudayev would take these pen and ink designs and create a submachine gun. He started work in 1941, and he looked at the PPSH and tried to make an already bare bones gun more bare bonesier. And the first concept guns were ready in 1942, and they would begin field testing and trials in March of that year, running through May. And it was well liked, and it was known as the PPS, basically Sudayev's submachine gun. Now, the committee liked what he showed, the first design, but they wanted it to be stronger, more durable, because well, they needed it to be cheap and easy to produce. It literally couldn't bend. Luckily, Sudayev himself had kind of seen some issues and released what he called the PPS-42 that summer, and it entered trials in July and was accepted. And there were several other applicants. It wasn't just his design, but it was accepted for service on July 28, 1942. And this was right at the most desperate time, the siege in Leningrad. So they very quickly started to produce these in the city just as soon as they could. And this would become the PPS-42, the forebearer to this gun here. Although, yeah, not a whole lot of differences. They would be rolling out by December of 1942 and essentially immediately being used against the Germans. And then in 1943, there would be another round of testing and trials that spring leading into early summer. And Sudayev again would introduce an improved design that would be accepted as the PPS-43, replacing the PPS-42 on the production lines. And by mid to late summer, it was being cranked out. And the idea, the Soviets were hoping to produce 350,000 per month. So, yeah, let's talk about features and lack thereof. Now, one issue with the PPSH was the drum magazine, but by 43, the stick magazine was appearing, so that addressed that for the most part. Another was a wood stock. Not a bad deal, but it did require wood. We could do away with that. Another one was actually the fiber buffer inside. It really did need that to run properly. And we had pretty heavy gauge stampings or multiple sheets of steel put together. We have this big shroud, and we have this safety on the bolt, which is a few parts. All in all, like I said, they could build these in between 6 and 7 hours, but because of the size and whatnot, it did require nearly 14 kilograms of raw steel, or I think 14 pounds actually, I think I said kilograms, 14 pounds of raw steel to build. Yeah, it's not bad, but you can do better. And of course the gun itself, even with the stick mag, is 9.5 pounds, and it's not the shortest guy on the block, and a folding stock is not an option. So that's kind of what we're getting to with the PPS series. This too is made from stampings. It uses fewer, although somewhat more complicated stampings than the PPSH-41, and they're joined together with welds, only using rivets when absolutely necessary. Now, the original design gun was a little flimsy. It was reinforced with what would become the PPS-42, and again strengthened a bit with the PPS-43. No wood. We do have a synthetic pistol grip, but of course you could make that out of anything, including wood if you had to. We did introduce a new magazine, and I'm going to focus on the mags shortly in and of themselves. We have a barrel shroud. We have a protected adjustable front sight, screws up and down. We have a very similar flip 2-position rear sight. And we have an underfolding buttstock. Rather top folding, sorry. That's the bad thing about videos. You can't edit. Well, you can. I can't. Now, some accredit this to the MP40, but while I agree the concept is the same, the execution is very different. This is why I was thinking underfolding. This stock has tubular arms with a rotating stamped butt plate, folds under, and it has a push button on the side. This stock obviously folds to the top, has a push button on the top, and is stamped, very squared off. Still has a rotating butt plate, but even that's a different design. So very different materials, different locking system for the stock, and honestly a better one because it locks on both sides, whereas the MP40 stock only locks on one. In fact, The MP40 stock was a known failure point of this design, and the PPS is a much sturdier one. I just wanted to point that out. I definitely see inspiration there, but I wouldn't call it a direct copy, personally. The original PPS-42 was a little longer. It was about just under 36 inches with the stock deployed and a little over 25 inches with it folded in. And it had a barrel the same length as the PPS-H and the PPD at about 10.6, 10.7 inches, a little under 11. It also weighed about 6.5 pounds, so significantly lighter than the PPS-H. But when they went to the 43, they made several changes. One, they reduced the barrel down to just under 9.5 inches long. They reduced the overall length of the buttstock, and they changed its latching mechanism to make it more stronger. These changes pretty much gave it a much shorter overall length, about 24 inches folded, so it didn't save a whole lot there, but when the stock was deployed, it was a little over 32 inches long. So kind of mostly saving on the shorter stock, but the barrel does help. Now they did want it a little stronger, so the weight did creep up a little bit to about 6 3/4 pounds. Other features, we have a muzzle brake here, a little more effective, also cheaper to make than the PPS-H. Typically we still had a chrome lined barrel, although it could be built without it. We have a shroud, although it's open on the bottom. Easier to stamp it that way. We remove the safety from the bolt. Now this is just a straight fixed bolt handle. Instead we move the safety here. Just a simple stamped lever. Initially with the 42 this locked the trigger. With the 43, to improve safety, it locked the trigger and locked the bolt in whichever position it was in. They also introduced a mag well that could double as a foregrip. And when they went to the 43, they increased the angle of the mag well to improve feeding reliability. And even the mag catch in here is a simple double piece of stamped steel. Now I say stamped steel, some might argue that it's rolled steel. I consider it simple stampings. It is sheet steel to some extent. It's not really complex patterns. And the whole idea, they didn't want something that needed a lot of trimming, shaping, final fitting. They wanted to be able to just crank out pieces, weld, rivet them together, and turn out a submachine gun. And that's pretty much what they had, especially with the 43 edition. They also, originally, the shroud and the receiver were two separate pieces joined together, which they actually are on the semi-auto. But on a military gun, they would be a single straight piece across. Again, just kind of a rolled piece of steel put into shape. It disassembles kind of opposite the PPS-H, whereas the PPS-H opens from the top and the bolt remains in the lower. This opens like a trigger pack down, kind of HK style, if you will. And the bolt remains in the top. Also with the 43, they made the ejector part of the recoil system, further saving on parts and time. All in all, they could build one of these with just over 6 pounds of raw steel and in under 3 hours, which is good because they needed to produce these to defend Leningrad. They did not make a huge number of PPS-42s, a little over 46,500, but considering they were only in production a few months and they were in production in a city under siege, that's pretty damn impressive. When they went to the 43, thanks to some of the simplifications and the fact that Russia's situation was getting better, they were able to turn out 2 million of these, most before the end of the war. Now, they would end production even earlier than the PPS-41 by 1946, but, in those 2 years, they made nearly 1 million per year. Not bad at all. Yeah, so it was lighter. It was much more compact. It was only full auto, but it had a slower cyclic rate. The PPS-41 was 900 to 1,000 rounds per minute, depending on the ammo loading. Would you be amazed to learn that World War II Russian ammo wasn't loaded the most consistently? The PPS-42-43 was anywhere from 600 to 700 RPM. So much like with the grease gun, it was more controllable, and the muzzle brake was reasonably effective. It maybe didn't quite have the same range and what have you as the PPS-41. PPS-41, 300 meters. This was only good 150, maybe 200 meters, but it was designed for reconnaissance units, vehicle, tank crews, special forces, and just urban warfare in general. But it actually proved to be a very good submachine gun, and it was very forward-thinking, not just in its essentially all-stamped and very resource-conservative construction, but let's talk about that magazine. I've heard more than a few people lament that it's a little unusual that they take two different magazines, that they're not interchangeable. They point out that, Russia was in the middle of a war, and it seemed like they'd want to conserve what they had. And on the surface of it, you are correct. However, keep in mind the time. When the PPS was being designed, there really wasn't a stick magazine for the PPSH. And even when there was, they weren't available en masse. And since the PPSs were being made to defend Leningrad primarily, they were going to have to make their magazines anyway. And it's a very good thing they did not design the gun to take this magazine, because this mag was designed to fit the PPD and the PPSH drum magwell. To that end, it has these very pronounced ribs, and it is a single feed, double stack, single feed. Now, interestingly, the MP40, the Sten, and the grease gun are all plagued by this kind of same design deficiency. Double stack, single feed is not great. It's not as reliable. It's harder to load. It's just finicky. It was an extremely good decision by Sudayev to go to a new mag pattern. For one thing, this is cheaper to produce. It's also double stack, double feed, like the Thompson magazine and the Beretta 38 magazine. Much more reliable, easier to load by hand, not as prone to damage, and it actually allows it to be a little more compact. Line it up. Oop, almost had it. You get the idea, though. It's shorter, and it's lighter for what it's worth. And because we don't have to worry about having a drum fit, we can have a true magwell. That makes insertions exceedingly easy. Try to do it here on camera. Very straight in, and the magwell doubles as your foregrip, protecting the mag and protecting the mag catcher. Whereas putting the mag in the PPSH is a little more finicky. You need to line it up right. They fit a little tighter. They're not bad, but just not as intuitive to get in and out, and they're in no way protected. There's no magwell, and there's really not a great place to grip this gun. So even though they were trying to make something faster and cheaper and more resource conservative to build with these, they introduced plenty of improvements. And it was still a relatively good, safe, solid, and durable submachine gun. And it had extremely few machined parts. Really, the bolt in the barrel and a very small trunnion. That's it. Everything else, very simple stampings. Again, rolled steel if you like. pressings. But it was honestly the technology of the future. The PPS-41 was kind of looking back. Even if it was a Generation 2 subgun, it wanted to be a Generation 1. This gave no craps and would certainly influence post-war not only submachine guns, but what we know today as assault rifles. So wrapping up World War II, the PPS-43 did an excellent job of defending Leningrad, and it was pretty much a better gun than the PPS-41 from at least a production standpoint. However, by the time it was really ready to go, the 41 was so iconic and Russia was no longer fighting on the back foot, they pretty much just kept these in production. By the way, this was a better like infantry in the field gun by the stock design. This was more of a what we would think of as a PDW, personal defense gun, for tank crews, what have you, and good for urban warfare, scout troops, reconnaissance. So they really did kind of fill two different roles. So they decided to kind of produce them concurrently. And that's why we do end up with 8 million total, but the majority would be PPS-41s. The PPS-41 would be mostly what Russian soldiers would carry. A lot of the PPS-43s would end up going to armies fighting in exile. Again, the Czechs, the Polish would get some, 43, 44. A lot of partisans fighting behind enemy lines would continue to use these, so on and so forth. So production would end right after World War II for this. They'd use up their parts and close it down. But all this stamping, pressing, welding, riveting technology that was developed and really perfected for this, and the double stack, double feed magazine made of stamped steel, that should look familiar to you for later things. Also, the utility of a folding stock, although underfolding would be their next direction. After the war, the PPS-41 would actually be given to a good number of Russian allies, including North Korea and China, who would both deploy it during the Korean War. And they would both make this under license. China would call it the Type 50. North Korea would designate it the Type 59. And this is where the burp gun name, they were used en masse in Korea, and U.S. soldiers learned to fear and respect them. They decided that, while the M2 carbine, the select fire version of the M1, was more accurate, especially at longer ranges, this thing could really lay down some lead. And quite frankly, the M1 30 caliber round wasn't any better than 7.62x25, at least not in a practical sense. So close range, they still were very devastating, and just as in World War II, they would have massed infantry using these. But again, they suffered from accuracy. Funnily enough, there were some PPS-43s in Korea, but they did not see near as much use. And this would continue on into Vietnam. Both would be there, but again, more PPS-41s. Oftentimes these were Chinese Type 50s. Sometimes they were reworked by the Vietnamese, being designated as the K50M. And these would stay in service to the 70s. Some of them were even used in the Sino-Vietnamese border conflicts. In Russia, these submachine guns would be kept around throughout the 1950s, while they still did not have near enough Kalashnikov rifles. Just a little known gun, you probably haven't heard of it. But once the modernized Kalashnikov rifle, built with a receiver that maybe has something to do with this one. Once that came around in 1959, 1960, that really allowed them to retire all their older submachine guns, which was good because they were already replacing the TT-33 Tokarev pistol with the new 9x18 Makarov pistol. So it kind of allowed them to shift all that to second line reserve type units. But of course, there would be influences outside of Russia, especially for the PPS-43. One concept that Sudayev worked on after the adoption of the PPS-43 was a variant with a fixed wood buttstock to kind of take the place of the PPS-41, hopefully to give better controllability, a little longer range, because it has a nearly 10-inch barrel, 9.5 at any rate. But this never went past the prototype concept stage, at least in Russia. But in Poland, it was put into somewhat mass production. The Polish First Army was given some PPS-43s during the war, and in 1948, Russia granted them a manufacturing license, and they began to produce it as the WZ-43 in 1951, running through 1955, until they themselves would go to the PMK, a variant of the Kalashnikov. But they liked the idea of the wood stock, and again, they did not have the numbers of PPS-41s like Russia did, so they essentially kept the same front end. They reworked the takedown system, changed the back end of the receiver, added a couple of tangs for a stock and a sling swat, and they came out with the PPS-4352 or the WZ-4352. And these were for guards, guys in the field on patrol. Now, one thing that Wikipedia has said for years is that there's a storage compartment in this stock. I've looked through more than a few of these parts kits that have come in, and none of them have a hole in the stock. So either there's two stock variants, or gas, Wikipedia is wrong. And Poland would produce about 111,000 PPS-43 variants. So not an insignificant number. Kind of neat, and of course we know them today because so many kits and these IO guns are here. Another one that's well known is the Finnish KP-44, nicknamed the Tin Henry. Because the PPS was used in Leningrad, that's very near to Finland. So Russian troops would deploy, honestly, a lot of the PPS-42s in Finland. And so they captured several and liked them. But they were firing 7.62 by 25, a round that Finland didn't have a lot of. They redesigned it and came up with this. And a lot of people just will say this isn't a copy of the PPS-43. I disagree. The front end looks very similar for sure. The stock is quite similar. Yeah, we have wooden grips, but the real difference is the lower. In order to let this take Suomi magazines, this whole section and where the hinge is located, the magazine catch, it's pretty damn different. So while I agree it's a variant and very clearly inspired by, it's not a direct clone or copy. They took the time to do this right. Now, another nation that captured a good number, especially of the PPS-41, was Germany. They grabbed a lot of them during the early fighting, and some later on too. They designated it as the MP-717R, and since the 7.62 Tokarev round was derived from 7.63 Mauser, they printed German language manuals and issued them with German Mauser ammo, reissuing quite a few, tens if not hundreds of thousands. And they liked it so much that they even had a rebarreling program so they could fire 9x19 Parabellum, 9mm what we call Luger. This involved a new 9mm barrel and a magazine well adapter so it could take MP38, MP40 mags, and these were designated MP41R, and they would do about 10,000 of those conversions. It's worth pointing out too that when they did convert the PPS-41 to fire 9mm, it slowed the cyclic rate down to 700 to 800 rounds per minute, so a little more reasonable if you want to conserve ammo. Germany certainly respected the guns, as they'd done with the SVT 38 and 40. but Russia certainly respected them too. And they were a common sight throughout the 50s and 60s in the Cold War era. And of course, there are some in militias and partisan hands to this very day that are still running because they just work. Phew, that was a long one, but we're done. But I really wanted to give credit because the submachine gun was so important to Russia in World War II and important to the communist nations in Korea and Vietnam. And so many were made. Yeah, Russia used a few other submachine guns during the war. For example, they had about 140,000 Thompson, mostly 1928 A1s, but a few M1s. They didn't really do a lot with them because they didn't have .45 caliber ammo aside from what came with the guns. And they didn't really need them because by the time the Thompsons started coming in .42, they had their own guns under production. The PPS-41 is still iconic in Russia today. And it's just a really great subgun with a very unique look to it. The PPS-43 really did correct on it a lot. Again, this used only about 6 kilograms of metal, whereas this used 14, nearly so. This took between 5.5 and 7.5 hours to build. This could be built in under 3. And it was simpler. There was a bit of fitting and carving needed with this, more welding. This really wasn't. But just as it had kind of happened with the Sten Mark III and the grease gun, by the time the simplified wartime stamped gun was truly available, the war had turned in favor of the Allies. Now, I'm sure Germany would have loved to have had something as easy to build as this or the grease gun in 1944, 1945. In fact, that's why Germany ended up making a copy of the Sten. But that's kind of why this gun wasn't as... and only in Russia would you say 2 million is a small number. But that's the truth. Nevertheless, it was very influential for next generation of guns. And there's a reason Mikhail Kalashnikov and others in Russia say this was the best submachine gun of World War II. When they look at everything, not just functioning in the field, but also manufacturing, resource conservation. Yeah. So, to each their own. That the best of anything is always subjective. It's always an opinion. They're both really cool. And shooting Tokarev, some 6.225 out of a semi-automatic has a better than even chance of actually working, whereas a lot of 9mm guns is too weak. But they're a lot of fun. They work pretty well. And since everyone liked my earlier Russian videos, I figured I would acknowledge these. Appreciate you hanging out with me, and feel free to talk about your own. That KP-44 you looked at, that was built by Rick Smith of SMG many years ago, and he uses pretty much the same method as here, except he does have a better fire control group, but his guns were $800, where these were $300, so yeah. And again, TNW built this as well as my Suomi there, and they did a good job with both. Alrighty guys, well I'm going to go have a rest. If you could, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support the channel, please check out the link to the Patreon page. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.